Coming to you live from San Diego, the Executive Director and Global Ambassador of Singularity University. His talks have been called captivating, educational, and downright jaw-dropping. With us last year and back by unanimous popular demand, please welcome Salim Ismail.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can see me all right. I'm on some sort of weird satellite uplink. I've got about 6 different wires hanging off me, so I'm completely in cyborg mode. I would love to ask the audience a quick show of hands. How many of you heard me speak last year? How many of you were here from the year before? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, excellent. All right, so that gives me some sense of it. All right, so what I'm going to do, it's roughly about 50-50, and about half of you are too tired to put up your hands, which is okay as well. What I'll do is I'll run through my normal framework, but reference some of the new things that are happening. In terms of what's going on, many of you know my background. I'm the founding executive director at Singularity University. I'm actually Canadian, originally from India. I spent 10 years in Europe restructuring large European organizations, mostly French ones, which is why I'm bald, and I think many of you will understand that. And I recently wrote a book on how do you organize for this new world. Almost exclusively the last 2-3 years I've been focused on what I call the immune system problem, which is if you try disruptive innovation in a large organization, the immune system will attack you. Right? Because all of our organizations are built to resist change and withstand risk. And we're finding now that that's the high order bit. Now, how do we deal with that? And in sharp contrast in the public sector, our existing policies are the immune system. And we can see in sharp relief what happens with Uber drivers and others over there. Literally life-threatening in some cases. And so that's kind of most of my work right now is how do you deal with the immune system problem? Maybe the strangest phone call I've received is from the Vatican. The Pope has the oldest immune system in the world, and as he tries to update that organization, he has some interesting challenges on his hands. We are dealing with a whole series of very kind of fundamental questions in terms of how do we navigate and manage ourselves going forward. We have this physical versus virtual world. Brands are turning into experiences, products are turning into services, and fundamentally the big question on everybody's minds is how do you organize for all of this increased pace of change, and how do we deal with that? Some of you will remember this graph. This is a graph from Ray Kurzweil looking at Moore's law. This essentially goes back all the way 110 years, all the way back to 1900. Ray put this together. It's essentially Moore's law, looking at the price performance of computation. And he found that we have been steadily doubling computational power for over 100 years, well before Gordon Moore made his predictions. And the question that he asked when he saw this data is, why is that curve so smooth and so predictable? Through wars and recessions and ups and downs in the industry, we should expect a very jagged stock market type of shape, not this very steady progression that we see. And Ray spent a full 10 years researching this, trying to understand why this was the case. And his fundamental observation was that once you take any domain or discipline or industry area or product area and you power it with information technologies, and it acquires informational flow properties, its price performance starts doubling very, very steadily. Anywhere from 18 to 30 months. And most importantly, once that doubling pattern starts, it does not stop. That just keeps going. And it's very hard to get our heads around that particular concept. And this is maybe the heart of this type of thinking, is most of our education, training, intuition about the world teaches us linear extrapolation. And yet the world is moving on this very exponential basis. If you have a smartphone, you have more computational power in that than the entire US government had in the 1980s. That's why it gets a bit hot, by the way. There's quite a lot of computation in there. And so how do we deal with that and kind of try and understand that as a key heuristic around our work? Peter wrote this book Abundance a couple of years ago, charting out that if you could harness this pace of change effectively, that we'll soon have an abundance of kind of healthcare, education, clean water, energy in about a decade. And what would the world look like if that was the case? Peter is, of course, the head of the X Prize Foundation, which gives large public prizes to solve market failures around the world. A few months ago, I had the honor of joining Peter's board. So I'm on the board with some rather interesting question. Every board meeting starts with, what the hell did Elon just announce? And I think many of you will understand that more than most as being a native son and so on. Now, the really key heuristic that we look at for the world is most of our education and training is this linear extrapolation. And as I mentioned, the world is entering this very exponential era. And when we apply that to industries, we tend to look at things in 3 layers. The vast majority of our history has been this kind of very physicalized world. All of the business models, revenue, value creation came from the sheer physicality in the world, right? Then we added products like the Kindle or iPhone, where the product might be physical, but all the revenue generation and value creation is on the digital side, and business models. And then with the rise of mobile and internet, we now have entire industries that are completely digital with almost no physical manifestation at all. And of course, we're seeing the world flip around completely today. We're seeing industry after industry go up that stack. More and more worlds are turning into a digital environment. And it's very hard to get our heads around that. I love this analogy that I take from the book, where the Tesla is not really a computer, it's not really a car with computers and sensors in it. It's a computer with wheels, right? And you look at it very differently when you look at it that way. And one of our alumni actually corrected me and said, you're wrong. It's actually, because it updates itself every few weeks, you have to think of it as an app that has wheels, and that really messes with your brain. But we can see the vector there and how things are going roughly. Now, we've seen kind of these 4 major dynamics happening in the world as a result of this forcing function of very fast-moving technologies. 10 years ago, we had maybe 500 million internet-connected devices. We're up to about 15 billion today. Ericsson made this prediction that we'd be at 50 billion, but now we'll soon be at 1 trillion. And I love that one statistic, 15 billion going to 1 trillion. We think we're 30, 40 years into the information revolution. On this metric, we're literally at 1.5%, right? We're just starting. So most of this disruption is ahead of us as opposed to behind us. And this really is we're starting to see very radically how quickly we're digitizing the world and what comes from that. I use this example a lot. I've showed this last year. This company can take 10 seconds of your voice, and just by analyzing the variation in the tone, they can assess your mood and your attitude to about an 85% accuracy. Customer service teams are using this. If an angry customer calls, can you recover the account, or should you just hang up the phone and move on? As one of my favorite kind of side effects, it turns out that just by listening to the tone of your voice, they've done a bunch of research with the Mayo Clinic, the healthcare medical clinic, and they found that we can now predict cardiac events just from the tone of your voice. And so we'll see some fascinating breakthroughs in diagnosis from this, where just from the tone of your voice, we'll be able to predict a cardiac event and whether somebody's going to have a heart attack or not. So just kind of incredible what we're seeing. Every week something comes out that our entire faculty goes, holy crap, can you now do that? And we're seeing this incredible set of breakthroughs happen. Now, the kind of analogy I like to use to try and describe this transition is the analogy we went through from film photography to digital photography, where when you move from film photography, which is operating on a material scarcity-based view of the world, and you move to the digital environment, you get these 3 fundamental dynamics taking place. Marginal cost goes to 0. As a result of that, the domain explodes and we start taking billions of photographs. Today we're basically holding the button down on all of our devices and taking that in many photographs. But the third thing that's really subtle, that is really worth pointing out, is you've changed the problem space. In a scarcity problem space, I may sell high-end cameras, I may offer courses on photography, I may publish books on composition so people can optimize for that euro a click or dollar a click for every time you take a photograph. It takes a few days to get your prints back, but it costs money. Today, with billions of photographs out there, we all have 10 copies of our photographs on 8 devices, and we can't find anything, right? And when you shift the problem space, you shift the business model. Nobody can make money publishing books on composition or offering courses on photography today. I just take 100 shots of my kid and I pick the best one. Now it's a filtering problem, not a sourcing problem. And we've changed the problem space from scarcity to abundance, right? And if you think about all of our industries and why they're struggling, all of the incumbents are optimized for this material scarcity incremental view of the world. And we're moving into this very digital abundance model. And this is part of the reason we're seeing this paradigm shift. And this paradigm shift that we've seen very clearly in photography, but although some of you are not old enough to actually remember film photography, but we're seeing that now in all of these technologies. all of them are going through this very dramatic framing shift of going from scarcity to abundance. Here's one way I like to frame it. This is a 700-year look at the cost of light. And you can see this graph going from 1300 all the way to today. It used to be really expensive, then it plateaus for a while, and then it literally crashes to zero, right? And what's interesting here is the shape of the curve, because here's the cost of DNA sequencing, and you see a very, very similar shape. Expensive plateaus and then crashes to zero, or the cost of solar modules, where we can see exactly the same shape. And in technology after technology, we're seeing this incredible breakthrough in the cost of technology dropping almost to zero across the board. And there's simply no exception that we can find in this. Now, very, very importantly, each of these technologies is moving at this doubling pattern, doubling every, as I said, 18 to 30 months. And so that's one level of acceleration. But wherever you have an intersection of these technologies, that adds a whole other multiplier to the equation, right? And the aggregate effect becomes very, very profound. And let me give you a couple of quick areas of where this is having a big impact in different worlds. Artificial intelligence is a key domain. In AI, the vast majority of it is where we augment existing applications like anti-lock braking systems, fuzzy logic, fraud detection, et cetera, et cetera. The reason that we use AI is we've not had an upgrade in our brains in about 50,000 years or so. If your iPhone was 50,000 years old, you would be deeply unhappy with it, right? But we have a lot of old biases and characteristics in human cognition, and we use AI to mitigate against a lot of these. We have sunk cost bias and framing bias and positivity bias and so on. This is a fascinating study of parole hearings. Should you release a prisoner from jail or not? Well, it turns out if you came up for parole just before lunch and the judges were hungry, you're going back to jail. However, if you came up for parole just after lunch and they were happier because they biologically happier because they'd eaten, it was 30% more likely that you'd go free. Right? And this isn't people trained to be impartial, so what hope is there for the rest of us in a sense? And so quite incredible, and now we can use data analytics to find and mitigate and compensate for some of these natural biases that we have in human cognition. This is a look at Google's Go champion, which Google's AI a year ago beat the top Go champion in the world. And when this happened, and it's really important to frame this, in the 50s and 60s when we were teaching computers how to play chess, we were literally thought that we would beat the top chess champion by about 1987. That was the rough approximation. It took till 1997 before IBM's Deep Blue beat Kasparov. But when we were playing Go, Go is a much more complex game. We thought we would not beat the top Go champion until 2030, and it actually happened 15 years early. And so that completely blew everybody's minds when this happened a year ago. And when you talk to and interview the defeated champion, he literally said what the AI did was truly beautiful. They'd never seen that type of a move before. Because in chess, you have about 250 moves per hop, and you can computationally kind of declare what's the best probabilistic move. But in Go, you have about 2,000 possible moves per hop, and you can't compute that. The combinatorial gets too extreme. You actually have to use human intuition to play a game like this. And so one way to frame it is we've now kind of taught an AI how to approximate human intuition, which we thought was only the domain of human beings before, right? And really in human beings, only women can do that, right? Men are pretty much useless at it. So when this happened in March of last year, this completely freaked everybody's minds out. AI completely transformed in that instant, because this was a new characteristic that was possible that had never been seen before. And then a few months ago, this happened, where we now have an AI that can beat the top poker players in the world. And that's a uniquely human game. We're bluffing, we're lying, we're trying to detect bluffing, et cetera, et cetera. And now we have an AI that can do that, right? So fascinating to see what's happening in these worlds. Now, really importantly, we don't believe that AIs are going to take over the world and run amok. We disagree with that thesis pretty fundamentally. And it really comes down to a definition problem where we have, with exquisite detail, we understand how, say, a mosquito works. But we're very, very far away from creating something even as basic as a mosquito. So it's important not to get caught in the hype and the hysteria of that. But there's no question that we're using increased analytics to get to the subtleties and nuances of human cognition in a way that we've never been able to before. Another domain that we like to look at is biotech. Here's the graph of reading DNA that I mentioned to you very dramatically. One of the most incredible breakthroughs that's happening today in biotech is this technology, CRISPR, which I think I mentioned last year. This continues to run incredibly, fascinatingly, accelerating in a very dramatic way. We have essentially now reversed, so it turns out bacteria do not suffer from viruses. This is the basic mechanism here. And for a long time, we wondered, how are they doing this? How do bacteria protect themselves against viruses? And it turns out they evolved a very elegant way of when a virus shows up, they store the DNA of the virus. And when a new one comes along, they literally edit it out of themselves. And so bacteria have created a self-editing mechanism to kind of modify their own genes. We have now reverse engineered this. Okay? And we can now edit the human genome as easily as you can cut and paste in a Word document. And this is really freaking out the world's bioethics folks, because this essentially means that a human being is now a software engineering problem. Very, very fascinating. The Chinese are already editing embryos in the womb. Literally a few months ago, scientists found you could edit HIV right out of somebody's cells, which is quite incredible, especially in your part of the world. And actually the most interesting thing that came out was a research report. So we all have inside of us 6 or 8 very bad genes that give us high propensity for heart disease, breast cancer, lung cancer, et cetera, et cetera. Well, it turns out if you use this capability just to delete those 6 or 8 bad genes, just that will extend human lifespan by about 60 years. Okay, just that. And so we're looking at some radical possibilities coming along. The opportunities here are quite staggering. If a child is born with sickle cell anemia, you can literally edit it right out of them, right? And I go back to that software engineering kind of paradigm to look at this. Every wet lab in the world is playing with this today. This is widely understood, extremely inexpensive. And so we're going to see some incredible breakthroughs happen around this area. Now here's the way I like to frame it. On the left there you see an ear of corn, which we're very familiar with. On the right is actually what an ear of corn looked like a few thousand years ago before we started breeding the heck out of it to be bigger, juicier, sweeter, etc. And this is the film photography analogy. You know, for thousands of years we've been crossing dogs, cats, horses, plants to select for the traits that we want. That's the film photography analogy. We've now gone to the digital photography version of biology. Now we can model an organism in software and print out its DNA and so on. And so with this kind of breeding to digital biology, film photography to digital photography analogy is what we're seeing here. Let me lift up and give you the implications at some industry levels, which I've talked about a little bit, but I want to kind of extend it. In autonomous cars, we're seeing kind of incredible breakthroughs happen. Today, we expect that once you have about a 20% penetration of autonomous cars, we'll see an increased traffic capacity of about 10 to 15 times on all of our roads and motorways. And it's fascinating when I think about real estate values, right? Real estate spikes in the middle of big cities globally because it's so hard to get in and out. When it's 10x easier to get in and out of a city, what happens to real estate? That will smooth out quite a bit. It'll light up the suburbs and the remote areas of a city pretty dramatically. Or once you have Uber or drones doing deliveries, you know, think about the idea that our entire society is based on geographic proximity. Retail store locations, bank locations, voting districts, school districts, pretty much everything. When you lift that constraint, we can completely reorganize society and reclaim. In Los Angeles, 60% of the land is devoted to the car. And we can now reclaim that and turn that into parks or condos more likely and see where that goes. Let me give you some predictions of mine of where this goes. I'll make a prediction to you, and I'm going to give you some context here. I've watched all of our speakers at Singularity University for 8 years, and I found that whenever we make a prediction, we're too slow. It actually happens much more quickly than even that we predict. So number one, I'll predict that within 5 years, it will not make sense to buy a combustion engine car. Okay, within 5 years, because battery technology is going that way. I predict within 8 years we'll stop buying cars completely because you'll have a car sharing, ride sharing service, and Uber, maybe autonomous in that sense. In 10 years, we'll have hyperloops and drones doing commercial deliveries, and then we try not to go past 15 years, things get better. I don't know how well you can see this video, but this is the latest Tesla self-driving car. And the technology is completely there. This car drives itself in every traffic conditions. I'm not sure how it would do in Johannesburg or in India, where I'm from, but certainly in any mainstream application, this totally changes the game. And this is real today. This is not accidental. Here's a fascinating story. This came out about 2 days ago, where next year we'll have autonomous cars in California, starting next year. Now, if you ask anybody in the car industry, they'll say this is 10, 15, 20 years away. It'll never happen. Fleet replacement is about 12 to 13 years on average. We think this happens much more quickly than people think because the economic pressure is so huge. Okay? In the US, 9% of GDP is spent just on the cost of accidents. That's just the cost of accidents. And maybe my favorite statistic, it turns out that 50% of all US court cases are car accident related. 50%, right? Now the US is pretty litigious, but really the implications are very profound around this. So very interesting to see there. So that's kind of autonomous cars, and happy to delve more in the Q&A as to what's going on in that world and what are we seeing. In healthcare, we're seeing the incredible rise of what's called the quantified self. We're tracking more and more data streams coming off our bodies. This is one of the more fascinating things happening in healthcare. This is the Tricorder X Prize, which I mentioned last year. It's a $10 million prize for when your handheld device can beat 10 board-certified doctors in doing a diagnosis. Well, here's the incredible thing. This prize was won 5 months ago. In April, there was a winner. So we now have a handheld device that will beat 10 board-certified doctors at doing a diagnosis. Think of the implications of this on rural areas where it's hard to get to a doctor, or emerging markets like in Africa where you have a doctor per million citizens. This is completely transformational, right? And I love the joke that if you're a hypochondriac, you'll love this device, right? In fact, you'll buy 2 of them because one of them must be wrong. It'll be chaos while we figure that out. Now, here's an interesting challenge if you want to try this out. Go tell your doctor this exists and watch the immune system response. You'll see this cognitive dissonance wall slam down. They'll say, that's impossible. I've spent 7 years in medical school. There's no way a device could beat me in doing something like this, right? Now, if you're a cancer doctor, there are 2,500 cancer research papers published per day. Okay, 2,500 published papers on cancer research per day. You have no hope in hell of keeping up with that volume of research, which is why we need this type of capability to complement. And what's interesting here is we found that the best performance, say in chess, an AI isn't the best performance. Actually, an AI merged with a human being is actually the best performer. So the best chess playing teams now are an AI supplementing a human being. And we expect that to happen with medicine and other areas very, very dramatically. Now, the biggest impact of any of this is going to be solar energy. I mentioned this last year. The solar energy cells are doubling about every 22 months in their price performance, roughly every 2 years. At this pace, we will hit 100% of world energy supply that can be delivered by solar in 14 years. If you heard me speak a year ago, I probably would have said 15 years. We're down to 14 years. We're very consistent on our predictions right now. Now, the implications of this are very, very profound, right? If this happens, and now it's a when, it's not an if, the Middle East completely collapses, right? The US will have to find other reasons to go to war. The kind of ripple effects are very, very profound. Here's the relative cost of solar to other fuels. There's the most incredible multiplier there. In November, December, solar became cheaper than the energy coming off the US grid last year. And so now we'll see a huge investment inflection point into solar. I've shown you this graph before of the cost of solar modules. This graph continues to crash. Literally, the cost of solar systems has dropped 30% just in the last year. The country of Chile is already generating so much solar, it's giving it to its neighbors for free. Okay? A quarter of the farms in California are already solar powered. And maybe in the ultimate irony of all of this, the Coal Museum in Kentucky is now using solar panels to power itself. And how do they look in the mirror is utterly beyond me in this domain. Now, there's a couple of more important ramifications to this. If you hit 100% in 15 years, right? Let me go back to this graph here. If you hit 100% in, say, 15 years, and it's doubling every couple of years, or 14 years, it means 2 years after that, in 16 years, we're at 200%. In 18 years, we're at 400%. In 20 years, we're at 800%, and that just keeps going. So energy, which has been scarce for the entire history of humanity, is about to become abundant, right? and it's now about a $6 trillion industry globally. We expect that to shrink pretty dramatically to about 1 trillion over the next 2 to 3 decades. So this will cause carnage with countries like Nigeria or heavy oil exporting countries, the Middle East, as I mentioned. In Canada, where I'm from, the Athabasca oil sands will never be used. Fracking in the short term, solar in the long term, they're kind of done. And so we expect there to be another oil crash sometime in the next year to two, and then it'll stay low, and we don't think it'll recover after that. Right? Now the big challenge is how do you store all this energy? We have the Tesla Powerwall. We have the Maslow, which is a competitor to that. Battery technology is lagging behind solar by about 7 years. But by about 2023, 2024, when you have solar and storage at the same level of maturity, it means the business model of every utility disappears. Okay? And so this causes another enormous challenge in how do we deal with this. Here's a fellow who's made a homemade Powerwall because it's not that hard. You string a bunch of laptop batteries together and you use it to store energy. And so people will start creating homemade solutions, and I think expect to see a lot of this in Africa. Now, I tried to live this. I don't know if I showed you this last year, but I actually tried to live this. I drove a Tesla from Miami all the way up to Toronto. I would get on the motorway, I'd hit the autonomous car button. Car drove itself for a large chunk of the time. And because the charging stations are free, I went 2,500 kilometers, and it cost me $0 to do this. And I call that a Gutenberg moment. In the 15th century, the printing press changed everything. I would frame it as we have about 20 of those hitting us today, because just autonomous cars changes everything. Then you add in solar, biotech, CRISPR, Bitcoin, drones, AI. I mean, the list just keeps going on, right? So this causes incredible sexiness on the technology side. We can talk a lot of that for a long time. By the way, we expect to break the aging barrier in about the next 5 to 10 years. So today, per calendar year that goes by, we're adding about 3 months to average lifespan. But with all of the stem cell therapies, treatments, organ replacements, etc., gene therapies, we expect to get to a point where we increase that more and more, and we'll get to a tipping point where per calendar year that goes by, we'll add more than a year to your life. Right? Now, when we hit that point, it means that we can essentially live for an arbitrarily long period of time, because per calendar year, I'm adding more than a year to your life. Just as an example, I have a friend with a kidney problem. They're giving him drugs to stabilize his kidney for 2 years because they know the medicine will be available to stabilize him for another 5 years after that. So you don't have to solve the whole thing, you just have to get to the next hop. And our best guess on the when of this is about 10 to 12 years. Okay, so within 10 to 12 years, maybe 15 at the worst, we'll have treatments that can have us live for an arbitrarily long period of time. Again, this is going to be an inflection point that we will never have seen in the history of humanity, and will challenge all sorts of things. Because the technology is all sexy, but we are not ready as a society to absorb any of this. How do you deal with people living for a very long time? Most religions are selling heaven as a business model, right? How do you sell heaven if nobody's dying? That's going to be kind of a challenge. I use the joke of marriage as another example. You know, we invented marriage about several thousand years ago. When marriage first surfaced as an institution, average lifespan was about 25 years old. So when we first kind of created marriage, you got married, you had kids, and you died. Marriage is not designed to last 50, 60 years. That's state-sanctioned torture, basically. And so dealing with these as a society is something we're going to have to do in a very, very new way. Every regulatory framework and every mechanism that I can see in terms of how we manage ourselves is fundamentally broken today. Democracies don't work in an age of an abundance of information and the pace of it. Our monetary systems, our legal systems, our healthcare systems, intellectual property is broken. We're going to have to reinvent ourselves pretty much from the ground up. Now, our brains freak out and our amygdala freaks out when we hear this, but actually the world is an infinitely better place than we've ever seen it. Here's extreme poverty, which was literally almost the entirety of humanity 200 years ago. Bill Gates thinks we will have eradicated extreme poverty within 12 years. And you will not see this in the news because it's good news. Here's just the last 100 years driven by technology. We can see the most incredible progress in maternal mortality, infant mortality, and so on. So we get really excited about this. We believe technology is a major driver of human progress. right? Actually, maybe it's the only major driver we've ever seen. And now that we have a dozen of these moving at a very accelerated pace, we get very, very excited. There are two areas where we have very particular concern. One is jobs. Here are 25 job descriptions and 25 industries and 50 jobs that get disrupted just from autonomous cars, right? Just autonomous cars disrupts this. And so huge implications there. Very, very importantly, we're not worried about radical job loss. We think it's a retraining issue, not a job loss issue. Whenever we can measure it, let's say Germany, we've automated all the factories in Germany and employment hasn't dropped at all. In fact, it's increased because there's so much more work to be done with problem solving, design thinking, increased efficiency, etc. So we think it's more of a retraining issue than a raw job loss issue. We're very, very, very worried about climate change. I've been living in Miami the last 3 years because according to our numbers, in about 20 years, Miami's gone, so better enjoy it while it's there. Once it resurfaces from the waves after this last hurricane, we'll see what's left of it. But literally, the sea level is rising about 1 centimeter a year. In fact, the entire state of Florida is an average 1.4 meters over sea level. And so pretty much it's going to be gone. We don't know how to reverse that in the short term. Now, from an economic perspective, we're seeing a couple of things happen. The first is the volatility is accelerating. It used to take 20 years to create $1 billion industry, and now that's happening in months. But this curve, this cliff of newspaper revenues is what we find most interesting. We find that whenever we digitize an industry, we go end-to-end information-based, you tend to see this sudden drop in revenues. Newspapers, where there's a 6x drop in revenues within 2 years. We saw the same thing in the music industry, a 10x drop in revenues in that industry. And it really speaks to how hard this is to spot. And I'm going to reiterate a couple of the examples I've made before around this. When the Google car first came out, the cost of the LiDAR, the GPS, the sensors, the radar added up to about $200,000 a car. And all the car companies universally looked at that and said, cute research project, but you'll never commercialize that. Then it dropped by 50%. 2 years later to $100,000 a car. 2 years later, it was $50,000 a car. We're down below $1,000 a car today, and everybody's freaking out. That LiDAR unit at the top of that Prius cost $75,000 5 years ago. You can get that today for $50. Okay, why? Because there's multiple accelerating technologies in it. Each of them is doubling, as I mentioned earlier, but the aggregate effect is orders of magnitude. And so this is the paradigm shift that becomes very profound. The next version will literally be $10 and look like that. It'll literally disappear into a smartphone. Okay? I showed this graph last year of Ericsson making this prediction that we'd be at 50 billion devices by the end of the decade. I talked to Ericsson a few months ago, and they said we were wrong about that. Our new prediction is 500 billion devices by the end of the decade. And something we see very consistently is we see that when an expert in an area makes a prediction, they're wrong by about 10x. Right? So this is not a math error, this is a cognitive error. And here's a more dramatic example. This is the cost of battery technology. Some of the lines there are the expert predictions, the Energy International Agency making this commentary. Literally, we're operating at 2 times faster than even the wildest optimists predicted. And so our experts all have 20, 30 years of expertise in a domain. They're always wrong by a dramatic example if the domain is growing exponentially. So I have a whole section in the book called Beware the Expert, right? Now we're seeing all these technologies go through this type of a curve where a domain becomes digital, the costs go to zero, you get open source communities forming, and the radical cost drop is leading to the most unbelievable democratization. A farmer in South Africa with a smartphone has more information capability in his or her hands than Clinton did when he was president. Right? That's a very profound thing to be able to say, that you go from the most powerful person in the world to one of the poorest in a generation. And so now Google is the same for that farmer as it is for Larry Page. So technology is quite a dramatic kind of democratizer of all of this. In the past, only a government or a big corporate lab could do truly disruptive innovation. But today, any entrepreneur goes into a legacy industry, comes in with a beginner's mind, leverages new technologies, and totally disrupts it. Elon Musk with the Hyperloop is a classic example of that. Bitcoin, which democratizes money and removes the effect of central banks, is a very powerful pattern. I think it has a real shot at becoming a default reserve currency in the world. And we'll see what happens with this. Probably Argentina will be early because they have a policy of defaulting on their currency every 10 years or so. Seems to be some sort of government policy. And the next time they crash, Bitcoin will become the default reserve currency. I'm deeply excited about the blockchain. If you've not researched this, please do look at this. I think this is the most disruptive technology I've ever seen because it allows us to have the authentication layer in all of our systems. And there's a lot of government services that are essentially third-party authentication, saying, yes, you have the paperwork, yes, you're the right age, et cetera, et cetera. And there's all sorts of systems like voting systems and others where we will replace traditional systems with this decentralized authentication system, which is open source and free, and anybody can use it. I would put Bitcoin in the blockchain about there. The technologies have now converged. We're looking at radical kind of possibilities coming along in the mix. Now, it's really important to note that this pace of change is not slowing down. It's actually accelerating. In terms of the broader demographics and from a marketplace perspective, we had 1 billion people online in 2010. We just crossed 4 billion people online. But by the end of the decade, and within 5 years, we think we'll have 7 to 8 billion people online. So actually the biggest marketplace in the history of humanity is being created right now in the next 5 years. And the simple question to all of you is, are your products and services ready for this unbelievable trillions of dollars in the new coming into the new economy? All of these people will have a smartphone or a computing device, and they'll all have access to broadband. There's about 7 competing technologies competing for broadband globally. The Google Loon project. This Israeli company wants to deliver gigabyte broadband within 5 years globally. And so we're going to have 5G globally within 5 years. And so what will that look like in terms of people having access to information that will completely change the world at that point? Now, the big question then becomes, how do you adapt to this, right? And we're seeing fairly dramatic advances in this. All of our business functions are being radically transformed. But this quote from David Rose has been stuck in my head for several years now. David makes the point that all of our organizations are built for efficiency and for predictability. They're top-down hierarchical structures, and they're not designed for flexibility or agility, which is what I try and document in the book, that we've got a new breed of organization that is moving at a completely new pace, operating at 10x its competitors by organizing in a different way. We're tracking an index of over 100 of these that are operating in a very unique way. I'll give 2 examples. TED is one I've used before, but let me show this one. This is Local Motors, a car company. They use a social network of about 100,000 car enthusiasts and car designers to help design the cars. The numbers are quite unbelievable. If you're a typical car company, it costs about $3 billion to design a new car from scratch. They can do it for 1,000 times cheaper than that. Okay? A typical car has 25,000 parts, theirs has 50. A typical car takes about 1,000 man-hours to put together, theirs takes 1. And a typical car requires about 1 million square feet of factory space. Theirs can literally be made on the size of the stage you're looking at. So here you have multiple orders of magnitude, multiple mechanisms where they're beating each metric on multiple orders of magnitude each. How the hell do you compete with that, right? And the answer is you don't, you can't. You have 3 options. Option 1 is buy them and shut them down, which is what we saw the energy companies do, or payments companies have done that for quite a long time. Option 2 is regulate them out of existence, lobby the government, and pass a regulation. This doesn't work either because it takes too long today. You know, think about the success of Uber. Their strategy is break the law deliberately, leapfrog to public acceptance, and wait for policy to catch up. And it's working in most places, right? Number 3 is what we recommend more strongly is partner with them, learn from them, invest in them, et cetera. And I know many of you are doing that with your companies. There are 3 fundamental components that go into building an exponential organization. The first is what I call a massive transformative purpose. We're seeing more and more companies and brands morph into this. The CEO of Gucci just declared he would turn Gucci into an exponential organization. Just 2 years ago, Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, ordered every brand in Unilever to take on an MTP. And now the 5 most profitable brands are the ones that have done it the most. And so this is a tagline that replaces the classic mission statement and kind of creates a North Star for the organization with a social purpose wrapped into it. And so we're seeing more and more brands morph into this, and I'm coaching a lot of boards and CEOs on how do you morph your brand into a massive purpose, which makes it easier to attract and retain talent, kind of acts as a guiding star for the organization. Then there's 5 externalities, which I won't cover heavily here, but Uber doesn't hire its own staff, TED uses community, Google is using algorithms, and so on, in terms of radically changing the externalities. What these organizations are doing is keeping a really small feature footprint and using one or more to scale very quickly outside. And so it gives you rapid flexibility. Then there's 5 internal mechanisms that allow you to manage the internal control framework and drive culture. Haier, the Chinese appliance manufacturer, does this. They used to be organized as a top-down 80,000 person pyramid structure, and now there are 2,000 autonomous teams of about 40 people each. Now, anybody growing up in the traditional business world will tell you, if you want to make 55 million fridges a year, you need a ton of centralized, product management, product strategy, demand forecasting, inventory management. Turns out you don't. Who knew? If you organize like this, they're actually able to do this. Now, not everybody does all of these, but if you do 4 out of the 10, you get a 10x performance improvement in your organization. So a really simple question to take back is which 4 would help me in my organization the most, right? We actually have created a survey where you can actually measure how scalable is your own organization structure. And I mentioned last year probably that we went on CNBC and we actually ranked the Fortune 100 by this score. We now have evidence that the fastest growing companies, the most flexible companies are also the best market performers. If you had invested in the top 10 most flexible organizations on this index, in the last 2 years, you would have outperformed the S&P 500 by 3 times. And so we're now creating an index fund, which will go to the different stock markets around the world, score the companies, and we'll invest in the top 10. We just ranked the FTSE 100 in partnership with Hult University. There's the top 10 showing the trailing returns, a 2-year trailing return with almost a 3 times performance improvement there. So our advice to big companies is, number 1, update your leadership that we're in this totally new world. I like the example of BMW. Their tagline, if you're BMW, your tagline is we're the ultimate driving machine, right? We're pretty clear nobody's going to be driving. So that's a huge tension to navigate if you're that company. But secondly, and most importantly, do not try and do this at home. If you try and do one of these big business transformation exercises, they usually fail. So we strongly recommend doing disruptive innovation at the edge of the organization, pointing into adjacent areas. Okay? If you try and do it internally, you'll have an immune system fight. But if you do it in adjacent areas pointing outwards, you can kind of expand your lifespan pretty dramatically. You keep going, you do incremental change at the core and disruptive things at the edge, and we're seeing a lot of companies do that. A great success story in this is Nespresso. The CEO took a separate team away from the core organization. The CFO was not allowed anywhere near it because they would defund it if they could. And now we're seeing the incredible success of that. Here's a company that's gone into an adjacent space. That spherical structure is a vertical farm. If you can see that, there's a guy sitting in the middle of that there at the bottom. That structure will feed an entire neighborhood sustainably. And if anybody's aware of who's doing this, this is actually IKEA. And so they've taken their core capabilities of self-built construction units and moved into an adjacent space. Of course, when you finish building that, there's a ton of extra spare parts left over. I wouldn't want to kind of clean that up. But fascinating to see how they're going to an adjacent space there. Today, what we're doing is we're helping companies run a 10-week process to solve their immune system problem. A couple of years ago, we piloted this with Procter & Gamble, where we find we're able to move leadership, culture, management thinking 3 years ahead in 10 weeks by doing this. We've partnered with Accenture on this process, and we're going to companies, and we find we can hack the immune system. And so I'm very excited about this. We're actually writing a book on this, and we're going to open source it because my thesis is every one of the Global 5,000 has to go through this process. We've actually recommended this process to the Vatican, so let's see if that actually happens. And so that's essentially my world today. I have a company that does this. We have a nonprofit that does this in cities, and we find we're moving the world pretty dramatically forward. We think we're facing kind of probably the biggest forcing function in the world that we've ever seen with technology. And we think it requires a very dramatic new way of thinking around this.